Mirëmbrëma dhe mirë se vini në Kallëzopën me. Mysafiri e mësonte është Mark Galeotti, i cili është ekspert dhe historian i Rusisë dhe shteteve të ish-bashkimit sovjetik. Ai ka shkruajt për aspektet ndryshme të historisë së Rusisë, sidomos i ka analizu luftrat e Rusisë që nga Çeçenia deri te lufta në Ukrainë. Libri i tij, Historia e Rusisë ndër shekuj, del në nëntor. Mes tjerash, Galeotti është kolumnist i 2 revistave të njohura në Angli, The Sunday Times edhe revistës The Times, si dhe është i njohur shumë për podcastin e tij Në hije të Moskvës, në të cilën ai bën analiza gati forenzike të elitës politike të Rusisë. Ai ishte në Prishtinë për shkak se u ftua si panelist në Asamblen e NATO-s që mbohet 2 herë në vit, e që quhet Rose Roth, Asambleja e Parlamentit të NATO-s, në të cilën Kosova ishte një koqirë si vjetë. Kosova ka qenë një koqirë edhe para gati një dekade, edhe i ka hise me qenë një koqirë tash në tetor 2022. Mark Galeotti mori pjesë aty në panelin që e analizonte ndikimin e luftës në Ukrainë në Ballkanin përendimor. E kërkova me ardhë në studio dhe ai pranoi me ardhë në studio me na tregu për ndikimin që ai mendon që lufta në Ukrainë mundet me pas në Ballkanin përendimor, por edhe në Kosovë. Ta ndëgjojmë çka tha zotni Galeotti. Mr. Galeotti, welcome to Kallëzopën me.
Oh, delighted to be here.
I've heard your participation just now. You were in a panel where you spoke about geopolitical implications in the Western Balkans of the Ukraine-Russia war. You came here for that. You shared the panel with the Minister of Foreign Affairs, head of Foreign Affairs Parliamentary Committee. What are the conclusions you got out of this panel? What are the implications for the Western Balkans of this war?
Well, I think what we have to appreciate is the degree to which the Western Balkans is seen, at least by the Russians, as being another potential flank in its conflict with the West, with Europe, with NATO, and so forth. And so many of the unresolved problems of the region are ones that the Russians can and almost certainly will exploit. And I think this is one of the key issues, is that for so long Europe has been, well, when I say Europe, I mean European Union in particular, but also NATO, has been rather complacent about the region, giving all kinds of promises but very little actual deeds to back them up. And I think this creates all kinds of opportunities that the Russians may well try to exploit.
And if we were to ask from you 3 snappy headlines to describe the situation in the Balkans, like you did when you wrote in The Spectator about the Gerasimov doctrine, Gerasimov being the current Russian chief of general staff and his ideology behind the weaponizing all manner of non-military areas of life against the enemy, what would you say are the Western Balkans headlines?
Well, first of all, given that there is no such thing as the Gerasimov doctrine, and I've spent years trying to persuade people of that, having sort of inadvertently created it, I'm a little hesitant, but I would say, look, if I had to create 3 snappy headlines, it would precisely be that the Western Balkans has been shockingly ignored for too long. Secondly, that what we could call the Stabilocrat doctrine has failed. In other words, this notion, even though they'd never really admit it, amongst the sort of the Brussels community, that said, look, we don't really care about democracy in the region so long as people offer stability. Well, that clearly is a disaster. But thirdly, precisely the point that I just made, which is that the Western Balkans risks becoming a new front in the Ukrainian war.
These 3 points you have listed from 2018 paper you wrote on European Council for Foreign Relations when you said, do the Western Balkans face a coming of Russian storm? At that time, in 2018, you outlined what may happen here. What are we likely to see? Just fast forward to 2022, do you think what you've predicted then happened?
I think it's happening is the honest answer. Because look, When Putin invaded Ukraine, he clearly thought it was going to be easy and quick. 2 weeks and it will pretty much all be over. That obviously proved to be a colossal and, for him, devastating misunderstanding of the situation. And at first, frankly, the Russians were in crisis mode as to know how to deal with it. And as the Ukrainians became increasingly effective in pushing back, that continued to be the case. The problem is now that we face winter. And with Putin beginning to flood the battlefield with mobilized reservists and conscripts, he's obviously hoping that he can hold the line and stop the Ukrainians from moving further. And then winter, the cold weather and so forth will probably make any offensive operations harder. And that's the point precisely when I think the Russians will be able to take a breath and think, well, okay, we've now stabilized the front line in Ukraine. Where else can we cause some trouble? Because if one looks at, for example, their continued positioning, not just in Serbia, that's obvious, but also in Republika Srpska, and in some ways in conjunction with the Chinese in Macedonia as well. I mean, it is clear that there are all kinds of different Russian assets in place that can be liberated, unleashed, not with any specific goal in mind other than just causing trouble.
So today you were arguing that just because there's no focus right now because Russia is disoriented or has no attention on the Western Balkans because it's too busy losing a war, if we may say so, we should not be too complacent. We should look and expect it will turn its eye and make it last long, make the war last far longer than the predicted end of it.
Well, yes, because from their point of view, they regard the weak link as being Western European will to continue to support Ukraine. Because let's face it, if they weren't supplying weapons, but above all, if they weren't keeping the Ukrainian economy pretty much alive on life support with a constant stream of money, then it'll be very, very hard for the Ukrainians to continue to resist. So from Moscow's point of view, it wants to distract and demoralize Europe. It wants to get them concerned with all kinds of other fires that are breaking out in their neighborhood.
So demoralize Europe. If it doesn't win the war, as it's not winning with Ukraine, can we see it affect the Western Balkans, and in what form? Do you see a nuclear response, or do you see a horizontal, as you frame it today, a horizontal intervention in other parts of the world, and how would that look for our region?
Look, I think that although we obviously need to take the nuclear threat seriously, because Putin keeps mentioning it, I think we're a long way from having seriously to worry about that. I think from his point of view, it's his last and most apocalyptic option. So exactly, I think that he'll be looking at other ways of escalating. Now, some of those are going to be in Western Europe with things like cyber attacks and so forth. Others are going to be on other flanks that matter. And for example, we're already seeing in North Africa attempts to, again, create some instability, create some new positions, and encourage the flow of migrants into southern Europe, because it knows that's something that worries the Spanish, the Italians, and the Greeks. Well, likewise, in the Western Balkans, it's a chance really to basically just create trouble. And so I think what we will be thinking about is a whole variety of different actors that will each have their own little job to play in this dialogue. So we may well be seeing, obviously, the Russian Orthodox Church, which is already basically an instrument of Russian power projection, will be seeking to basically stir up trouble and encourage much more sort of nationalistic and aggressive postures. But that's in some ways a very familiar one. I think we're also going to see Russian business interests being activated much more directly to support the kind of parties, not necessarily which have to be pro-Russian, but just basically just divisive. Again, this is what we've seen elsewhere, is that the Russians' goal is not to try and take over. It's not as if I think they have any dreams of creating some new imperial territories in the Western Balkans. It's quite the opposite. It's to create chaos. And if that means supporting extremist parties that may not be in any way pro-Russian, that's fine. They'll do that too.
And in creating chaos, you spoke today in a seminar about a scenario which is more familiar to Kosovo. Autonomous groups doing things which they think Kremlin may like and may ask for its support or approval. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yes, we've often got this notion that somehow Putin's Russia operates as if it's some kind of criminal mastermind's business empire in which one man, sort of the brooding boss of them all, runs everything. And that's not the case. Putin is in many ways a very lazy autocrat. What he wants to do is set very broad objectives and then have all his different underlings scurrying around and trying to come up with other plans that they can sell to the boss or do things themselves that the boss will then smile on. Because then, let's be honest, the real currency in Russia is not the ruble, it's political influence. If you've got political influence, you become rich and powerful and whatever else.
And this is a model, I want to go to this, political influence and business linked together is a model of leadership with some Balkan leaders. And I want you to explain this stabilocracy, because you said exactly this is three things that Russia will be looking to feed on. What is stabilocracy?
Well, stabilocracy was this very, very pernicious notion that really, for a while, as I said, it was never really formally admitted, but actually became very powerful in Brussels. This sense of, look, and I'm just simply channeling their views, not expressing it myself. The Western Balkans, it's a bit of a problem. We don't really have an easy answer to it. We don't want to spend too much effort and resource onto it. So what we will do is support regimes that essentially are just going to keep things stable. They will pretend to be democrats and we will pretend to believe them. We'll all really know what's going on, but at least we'll have stability. We won't need to have to kind of worry about the Western Balkans. As I said, this was a disastrous mistake because what it did is it encouraged these anti-democratic and often sort of semi-criminal regimes to establish themselves. And as long as they said the right thing, as long as they went to Brussels and gave a nice speech, everyone was happy. Until you realize the problems.
What makes you think it's still not the case?
I think it's because, and it's only just beginning to happen now, there is a realization of the degree to which this is not actually a lasting solution. Actually, this just builds up problems. You know, when it comes down to it, Western Europe's security will be best guaranteed by a prosperous, stable and integrated Western Balkans.
Ah, stable. You said stable. Vučić is stable.
Ah, yes, but it's not really stable, though. You know, these authoritarian regimes, they can hold the line for a while, but actually all they end up doing is building up new pressures. There will in due course be some kind of power struggles and so forth. There won't be the kind of institutional controls. Let's face it, it's actually legitimate and institutionalized governments which are going to be the most stable in the long term. But that's hard, and therefore for too long people just ignored it.
But in many ways he continues to be the focus point of Serbia, continues to be the focus point of Russia's proxies in the Balkans. Most of its neighbors think Serbia is a problem. On the other hand, for a man like yourself who explains things going through the history of how somebody who they used to be, you spoke about Putin's trajectory as first entering the politics as a KGB officer, then moving up. For most of our viewers, Vučić is the Minister of Information of Slobodan Milošević. He is today running Serbia. Europe from him expects to make a deal, to be the peace man who signs a deal with Kosovo. Kosovars have been constantly saying to Europe, you don't know this man, we know his history. You just spoke about Europe's closing one eye and saying, let's deal with who we have. How do we move forward with a person who forever will be inclined, because his history is such, to not accept Kosovo's independence? What's your advice for Europeans?
Look, I think the first thing is precisely one moves away from what people say to what they do, because that's been one of the crucial issues. Vučić has known very well how to play the games of Brussels while, as it were, playing Western Balkan politics in a different way. Secondly, though, it is, look, the fact of this, someone like Vučić, I mean, he is an entirely self-interested pragmatist. At the moment, it's very convenient for him to play a game of equipoise, a balance between Russia and the European Union. And he, to the European Union, he more or less says, look, if you push me too far, I still have a friend that I could deal with. And likewise to the Russians, he say, look, I love you dearly, but I need the European Union money. So, I mean, he can play that game. And again, Brussels has allowed him to do so. There comes a point when, on the one hand, Brussels needs to be willing to commit seriously to the region and say, look, we actually are going to actually come through on our various promises. But there is a price. And now, it could well be that it's going to be impossible to reach any kind of a deal with someone like Vučić. But the point is, at present, Serbians, most Serbians, after all, they understand that their future is with Western Europe. Even if it's just on the pragmatic point of that's where the money is. If it becomes clear that Vučić is the figure, the one figure that is standing between them and this future, then that actually becomes a political problem for him.
I would like to believe that, but the opinion polls in Serbia say that 70% of Serbs think positively about Putin, agree with his strategy. What would you say to that? Those are the figures that your co-panelist Sonia Biserko used today. They are quite credible figures. Since the war, the sentiment is majority of sentiment. I'm not saying entire Serbia, but majority of Serbia seems to be supportive of Putin's strategy.
No, that's absolutely true, because at the moment there is absolutely no downside in doing so. There is no cost. It's the same way as actually there were opinion polls at the start of Russia's war in Ukraine, which showed very high levels of Russian support for it. But that's because they were supporting the war they were being showed on television. That this is going to be a very limited war to stop a bunch of Ukrainian Nazis from committing atrocities against Russian speakers. And in that context, it is kind of understandable, because that's what they were basing it on.
You're right. You say there is no cost, and there is no cost for Serbia, because majority of their funding and donations, as you've written in your articles, are coming to Serbia from Europe, from Germany, France. More money come from Europe, many more billion more than
But Serbians don't think so.
Than Russia. Serbians don't think so, but no, Serbians don't have to align with one another. They're getting everything they want from Europe, the money, and their sentiment can be where the historically was the sentiment. So when you say there has to be a cost, are you suggesting to cut the funding? Or what is concrete actions you would suggest if the attitude is that you give Serbia as much money as you can and they're getting it and the sentiment remains as it is?
Well, look, there needs to be tough love. I mean, exactly, there needs to be that point where we can say, well, look, if we are going to continue to support, then this is what we expect from you. I mean, I think at the moment that hasn't been there. And I think in some ways, I mean, the potential love ought to be even greater, because exactly there ought to be some much more rapid channels for joining both the European Union and NATO for countries in the Western Balkans. But that cannot be without a price. That cannot be just simply as a blank check, because at the moment that's really what it is. At the moment, in some ways, no one really believes that Serbia will soon, or will become a member of the European Union at all. So in a way, Serbia has no reason to actually reform the way it's meant to. And nor does it have to worry about losing its money, because it's still getting that. I mean, I think this is the thing. At the moment, there is this hypocritical attempt to just basically buy off Serbia. There's a sense of, look, here's some money, just don't bother us. Well, it's not working.
And what do you think would work?
Well, exactly. I think they're saying, look, you want the money? This is what we expect from you. And if you don't, then that money will not be coming to you.
What if they're okay not to have the money?
Well, I mean, look, I'm not going to claim any great insights into the Serbian mind, but on the other hand, human beings tend to actually prefer to have a comfortable life than not have a comfortable life. Now, again, if it's, I mean, the European Union will have to frame this as something other than just a very blunt ultimatum. But nonetheless, exactly, there has to be that sense that with the resources comes responsibilities.
Okay, even without going to the tough love moment, you today spoke of exactly what I planned to ask you about the Thessaloniki summit. 2003, there was Thessaloniki summit, which spoke of the Western Balkans' path to faster European integration. 20 years on, 2022, almost 20 years on. Are we further than the Thessaloniki summit? We have another thing being called Berlin process. There was the Thessaloniki process. Are we just naming processes differently, but stagnating, or going backwards from that time?
Look, again, others will know better about the details. As near as I can tell, There has been some progress, we have to acknowledge that. But in many ways, that is progress which has come from countries in the region, such as Kosovo, which in some ways have grabbed the opportunities and reformed, and then gone to Europe and said, look, you see, you're going to have to acknowledge that. But in terms of how the initial summit was framed, the Thessaloniki summit was framed, it was meant to be that Europe would be a partner on the way. And there, I think Europe so far has largely failed. There is more to partnership than just providing funds. And I think at the moment that's been lacking. So a little bit of progress, it's not an exciting answer, but there's been a little bit of progress, but no means enough. And the gap between the promise and the progress is precisely the vulnerable point that the Russians and indeed the Chinese and others can exploit.
But what we hear today is Kosovo largely complaining that it's not being treated seriously, to Vučić, who you very rightly say, to Serbia, who has played the game. So, clearly, rather than sit and complain about it, what do you think Kosovo should do better in playing the game, if it has to do?
I mean, this is the difficult thing, because in reality, what's happened is that the countries which are more inconvenient have in many ways acquired more leverage in Brussels, because they've more or less become more of a problem. Now, I would not want to advocate Kosovo should become more inconvenient. But I think in some ways this is the dilemma that the European Union has itself created. And I think actually, look, in an ideal world, it wouldn't happen. But I mean, I think really what Kosovo would probably need to do is not so much become inconvenient, but if one looks at those countries which have punched well above their weight diplomatically, it is actually precisely in that they have mobilized a coalition of allies. Kosovo in many ways has actually been sort of very closely affiliated with the United States. There's all kinds of great advantages, especially within the context of NATO. But it doesn't give you any particular leverage with the European Union. And I think that is really where Kosovo needs to go. But as I said, I mean, it's for Kosovo's Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work out exactly its route. That's just from an outsider's perspective what seems to be the best approach.
But from Kosovo's perspective, you heard today two requests, and I'm wondering if they're overstretched, if they're naive, or if there's anything close to, it is now coming home for Kosovo to be taken seriously in these two requests, which is a fast track to NATO membership, fast track to a closer EU membership. Do you think it's too fast-stretched for Kosovo to reach that?
I don't think so, personally. I mean, look, I understand the political sensitivities, which have been sort of holding back. But when it comes down to it, is there any question about that Kosovo is on an accelerated route towards meeting the criteria for membership? I mean, I don't think there is, and no one really questions that. It's purely about the knock-on impacts of other parts of the region. What this has done is created a lowest common denominator approach, which more or less says, well, look, if not all of the Western Balkans is ready, then surely we should hold back. I think that's a serious mistake. I think Kosovo needs to be treated on its merits, and its merits, I think, are pretty clear. But also, going back onto the issue of the Serbian factor, and exactly this whole notion of, well, what is the jeopardy for Serbia? I mean, however uncomfortable it would be, a Kosovo that was part of NATO would instantly have a heightened level of protection under the Article 5 guarantees, rather than the kind of rather ad hoc impact of KFOR and so forth, however useful KFOR has undoubtedly been in its time. But most importantly, the spectre of a Kosovo that had an accelerated route into the European Union, the very thing that a lot of Serbs actually would like for their own country, even though their perspectives of it may vary, is, I think, something that would be a very powerful statement that the European Union is back in the Western Balkans seriously. But
precisely because you are such an outsider, you confessed to me that you haven't been to Kosovo before, and you said, this is the first time, don't expect me to be an expert in Kosovo, but precisely because you've heard narratives only from being on the outside about Kosovo, do you think Kosovo has been a victim of other people's narrative, other states' narratives about it, rather than mise-en-scène its own narrative, set its own narrative? Have we done enough of that?
Look, I honestly can't answer that. All I would say is that, look, all countries are perceived in the context of their own region. And I think this is part of Kosovo's tragedy, is precisely because it has been considered not as a country in its own right, but as part of the Western Balkans. This very event that I was speaking at was precisely about the Western Balkans. And I think that's something that Kosovo needs to find ways of breaking out of it. And there are other examples. If you look at the Baltic states, I mean, actually, each of these three small countries which broke out of the Soviet Union after a period of control by them, but actually they were incredibly assiduous in actually building this notion that they were not post-Soviet states. They actually, should be considered in their own right and so forth. Now, I mean, I don't know the extent to which Kosovo has been doing that, but I wonder actually if Kosovo has been reaching out to the Baltic states precisely to enlist them as allies in saying, look, we are in some ways in a very similar position.
You've written about the difference between Baltic states and Western Balkan states and how open or vulnerable they are to Russian influence. I've read articles about it, and you spoke how the West should not treat the Western Balkans like the Baltic states, who have very strong institutions, who have strong democratic standards, while the Western Balkans don't. And you spoke about vulnerabilities of the Western Balkans. Why is it that countries in the Western Balkans who are further from Russia are more prone to its influence than the ones closer to Russia? How can you explain this?
I mean, in some ways, it's precisely because they're further. Look, if you are a country which went through a period of Soviet occupation, with all the brutalities that involved, you are unlikely to be at all romantic about the idea of Moscow. And look, I mean, the experience is very dramatically. I lived in the Czech Republic for quite some time. The Czechs, obviously, they went through their own period of oppression, particularly the suppression of the Prague Spring and so forth. They are not in any way as vehemently anti-Russian as, for example, many Poles are. So, each country has its own specifics, but nonetheless, the thing that unites, it doesn't matter if you're in Romania, or it doesn't matter if you're in the Czech Republic, or if you're in Lithuania. You all have a clear understanding of what kind of a state the Soviet Union was, and Putin's Russia is now. Whereas if you're further away, it's easier to be a bit more romantic, to see in Putin a heroic figure pushing back against American hegemony, or just simply look at the historic ties and such like. So I think that's one of the key points. But another thing, just to very quickly mention, is, look, governance is the new battlefield in terms of these kind of non-military styles of conflict. And there's nothing uniquely Russian about bad governance. A lot of countries have it. But nonetheless, this is absolutely what creates one of the vulnerabilities to Russian interference.
The ones that are most vulnerable to what you're talking about are, as you said, the estranged communities, smaller communities. And my colleagues, Serbs who do journalism, are feeling the most of the pressure, Serb journalists in Kosovo, who are attacked by bigger disinformation campaign from Russia in smaller groups, formerly violent, presently violent groups who live in north of Kosovo. How does one counteract such an invasion and flood of disinformation? What's the recipe? Has there been any success stories to address disinformation campaigns?
Yeah, I mean, the usual success story that is trotted out is actually Finland in terms of countering disinformation, because there, from the very beginning, they made a point of trying to educate the whole country in how disinformation works, what to look out for, and so forth. That's a very idealistic notion. I mean, it's lovely if countries can do it, but very few countries can. More broadly, though, again, the key thing about disinformation is to have a sense of legitimacy with the official sources. I mean, one of the key problems that I've encountered in countries, particularly in Central Europe, which have been quite vulnerable to Russian disinformation, is you have governments which often have, frankly, abused government media to put out their own messages, that they're not honest. I mean, you need to have transparency, you need to have a sense of participation. I mean, it's all the basic things that makes a society hold together. If you can crack that, and that's obviously a very big thing, but then actually the disinformation problem tends to actually fix itself, because people are more likely to think, what is this rubbish that I'm reading on
But what
Twitter?
keeps a lot of these communities together are their ethnicity, nationality, and their spiritual affiliation, their religion. So two things which I would contradict what you say, two things that keep them together can be terribly exploited by the disinformation campaign. So a nationalistically prone society, how does it need to separate itself from the Russian propaganda? A very orthodox spirited society who takes its lead from Serbian Orthodox Church, how can it separate itself from Russian propaganda?
Until February, most of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine took its lead from Moscow. And then after the invasion, there's been this extraordinary schism and broken apart. So it's not actually that this can't happen. Now, okay, that's a very, very specific and extreme case. But I think, one of the key things is, and look, again, there's no easy answers, is precisely about attacking the very notion that to be a Serbian, ethnically Serbian, is to somehow feel that you need to look to Serbia for your instruction and so forth. And more to the point, that there is no place for you in today's and above all tomorrow's Kosovo. So a lot of it is about integration. And this is something that, let's be honest, it's a generational thing. It's not actually as if it's that easy just simply to convert people, to sit them down and have a good conversation over a nice cup of tea, and they'll say, gosh, you're right, and abandon all their old views. I mean, in some cases that can be done. If one looks at, for example, one useful example is what's happened in Northern Ireland, where there were years, decades of very bloody, internecine, religiously oriented, civil war in effect. That slowly was able to be worked through, and a lot of it was precisely by citizen diplomacy, by people reaching out on both sides of the aisle. But this isn't something that can be quick. So in the short term, what you need to do is precisely you need to be able to attack the disinformation, limit it. You need to have good counterintelligence to make sure that what isn't just simply problematic media narratives, when you actually have foreign agents coming in to stir things up, they can be quickly caught, identified, and either imprisoned or expelled. So you need to have the policing instrument. But again, that can't be the whole answer. There also has to be the long-term integration strategy that says, look, you can believe what you want and still be a good, loyal, happy Kosovan.
In the integration strategy, you're talking about what can we do inside the societies, but outside the societies, today in the conference you heard the Western Balkans NATO representative to say that the invasion of Russia, the illegal invasion of Russia to Ukraine, was a clarifying moment. I mean, let's just stop here and think about it. This is what we need. This is what we needed as a clarifying moment. I will say something controversial then. If there wasn't for this invasion, we wouldn't be taken seriously in our argument on how you cannot work with autocrats and expect to get the same thing and give them money and expect them to sign a deal. Then this invasion, this war was welcome for those who are trying to say this over and over for 20 years, that this is not possible.
That is depressingly true. I mean, I think that there is a danger in painting all of Russia as being sort of a source of all evil and the sort of the Mordor of a modern Middle Earth. But nonetheless, I mean, what is clear is it has demonstrated the extent to which the Putin regime, and I think it is important to separate the regime from the people, but the Putin regime has reached a phase of its existence which is pretty much antithetical to the values that we hold in the West.
You said that it's even not smart what they've done, that you did not predict they will be this unsmart, that Putin wouldn't be this unsmart to do what he did.
No, I mean, it's fascinating the degree to which, in many ways, Vladimir Putin has been Ukraine's secret weapon. That, the very decision to invade was clearly sort of badly thought through and based on his own prejudiced notions of what Ukraine was. The strategy he adopted at first was not what his generals wanted, but his own idea, and it was, again, a disaster. And he's continued to micromanage, but above all, to mismanage this war. And again, it's a classic syndrome of what happens to an autocrat when they've been in power so long.
You phrased it well when you opened the talk today by saying, 22 years of military reform of Russia has been ripped apart in 22 weeks of fighting by Ukraine. Amazing. Like, as a war strategist that you've been writing so many books on war strategy, did you predict that Russia would do this bad and Ukraine would do this good? Did you predict it at all?
No, I will be absolutely honest. Because in some ways, I had assumed that the Russians would fight a war the way the Russians talk about fighting a war, the way that they prepare, arm, and train to fight a war, the way the generals would fight the war. Instead, what we got was a war as envisaged by one ex-KGB man and his small circle of ex-KGB advisors, none of whom have any serious military experience. Again, it's the arrogance of authoritarianism, to think that he knew best rather than handing the war to his generals.
So then you said there will be no forgive and forget moment. Now that NATO has gone through 6 months of this war, seeing this war, do you still see any opening for other members? Do you think that they're seriously considering, or we will go back to business as usual? You spoke of long winter ahead. Do you see, apart from realization rhetoric that we understand how serious this is, we welcome new members theoretically, in practice, do you see anything changing?
This is a debate that is going on. I mean, I think that I can't say that it's been won or whatever. But look, I'm currently based in Washington, and I usually live in London. And I also travel quite a bit to several European capitals, including Berlin and Paris. And the interesting thing that strikes me is, whereas 1 year ago there was pretty much a consensus that, oh, NATO membership expansion, yeah, it's important, but it's not a priority. Now one can actually see much sharper divisions within these various circles. And I think particularly the United Kingdom and America are moving much more towards this notion of exactly that, in fact, there can be no long-term security in the Western Balkans without seriously addressing the issue of NATO expansion. Because exactly everything does connect to everything else. Modern wars do not confine themselves to the battlefield. They expand in all kinds of different ways. And even if there's no Russian paratroopers crossing the border, you know, heading towards Pristina airport, as they did back in 1999, there are all kinds of other Russian forces, influences and such like, which could.
I want to remind you of that Russian invasion of the Pristina airport, when we thought the war, looking at the TV, same as you, we thought Russia is so serious, it's won NATO over, it reached the airport beforehand, when actually they were so thirsty, they were without water, NATO soldiers had to hand over water. It's amazing of why we build in our imagination, the emperor always is with clothes and ends up without it 20 years later. Why do we have this psychological problem on thinking they are bigger than they are?
I mean, this is one of the interesting things. I mean, this is it. The emperor doesn't just have clothes, he has a uniform. I think there's several reasons. One is, remember, the people who make decisions in particular, most of them, and my generation as well, are products of the Cold War, products of the days of Soviet superpower status. And in a way, it's hard to disaggregate Soviet Union from Russia. Secondly, the Russians are very, very good at playing games of bluff. One can go into all kinds of stereotypes about chess and such like, but no, nonetheless, the Russians were able to play very effectively a weak hand. But finally, there is the fact of, look, whatever else one can say about Western democracies, they are risk averse. They would rather deal and settle rather than challenge. And I think this is something that Putin in particular has always exploited. But it's not just Putin. I mean, again, Pristina happened before Putin's presidency. You know, but particularly, I think Putin has understood that. He's not very clever. He doesn't really understand the outside world well. But one thing he does understand is people. I mean, this has always been his one key skill of knowing how to manipulate people, individuals. And I think it's actually key leaders of Western countries whom he's able to, you know, find some way of manoeuvring into the position he wanted. So it's a complex of reasons. But yes, but going back to this earlier point about the invasion being a clarifying moment, I mean, I think this is one of the key points. Putin is one of the very few world leaders who's ever called his own bluff. You know, having built up this notion that he has the second biggest army, second most powerful army in the world, it's now clear he has the second most powerful army in Ukraine. I mean, actually, that he's much, much weaker. And up to the point where he invaded, no one really could be sure about that, but now we can.
And also you spoke about the fact that Ukraine was doing bad with investors even beforehand. So investors were going out of Ukraine, Westerners were visiting Moscow. I want to push you on this. What we see from here, from this perspective of where we're sitting, for 20 years being told and babysitted to compromise with Serbia, give away things to Serbia, allow for much more authority of Serbia and Serbian Orthodox Church over Kosovo. At the same time, we see the West that took Russian gas and funded Russia and did business as usual with Russia, and now is in crisis, having not built any reserve system of their energy. What do you think of Kosovars who feel, are you the ones telling us how we should be talking to a former or current enemy, and whether you can be trusted to do this? What do you say to those Kosovars who may watch you and think, well, Germany, that is now supporting Kosovo, supported, fully depended on Russia and supported Vučić fully?
No, I mean, it's an entirely fair point. The truth of the matter is that it's actually often the countries which were then derided for being much too hawkish on Russia, such as the Baltic states, such as Poland, such as other Central European ones, and Finland, that actually are now saying, well, we're the ones who told you so. And for years, we were being told, oh, you're just over-extreme, over-excitable hawks and so forth. So yes, I think that's an entirely fair point. Europe for so long, I think, was in a way, and I can't criticize it too much, because I think we have to realize that there was nothing absolutely inevitable about this war. But there was this thought that actually engagement in and of itself would somehow magically transform Russia positively. And in some ways,
you mean the economic engagement with Russia would transform
economic,
Russia?
But also some degree of political, but both. But in some ways, I mean, this is the striking parallel with Serbia. That sense of precisely, well, we'll engage with Serbia, we'll give it money, we'll expose it, we'll invite it to seminars about how transparent law-governed states work, and we'll think that somehow magically that'll, by osmosis, seep into the country. Well, there are many Serbs for whom it has. I mean, let's be honest. You know, there are all kinds of Serbs who are opposed to the current regime, but certainly for the power structure, nothing of the case. Instead, they just couldn't believe their luck, just as Putin and co. couldn't believe their luck. That for so long, Europe was willing to deal with them, to trade with them, and in many ways allow them to get away with whatever they wanted.
And you see today, you see a lot of cooperation that between Serbia and Russia. You see a military center, a humanitarian center in Niš. You see weapons being exchange of weapons and buying of weapons of Serbia from Russia. I'm wondering, at the same time, we see Ukraine's advancement and how it's talking to allies. Is there anything to learn for Kosovo from this relationship now?
I'd make 2 points. One of them is in terms of Serbia's relationship with Russia. One has to wonder whether or not there's people, whether it's Vučić or people around him, who are just beginning to wonder if they might have backed the wrong horse. And this is not just simply about the wider political affiliation. It's also, actually, for example, are they going to be able to get spare parts for all these Russian pieces of military kit that they have acquired? It's not actually as if the Russians seem to have spares themselves. So it may well be that they will actually realize, at some point in the future, they will realize that they made a serious historical mistake. But the second point is, it's quite interesting if you look at how President Zelensky of Ukraine has handled the West, because he has been absolutely willing to break diplomatic etiquette. He has called out countries and leaders whom he feels have not actually been properly supporting Ukraine. Basically, he has been able to sort of leverage his position as kind of a modern Winston Churchill meets Che Guevara.
Tell me an
very
example of
effectively.
where he broke the diplomatic etiquette.
When he basically said that the German president wasn't welcome because Germany wasn't actually supporting Ukraine properly. I mean, that was actually...
By sending tanks, he meant, yes?
Yeah, exactly. Well, more than just tanks, but yes, exactly.
Weapons, didn't send enough weapons.
Precisely. I mean, so this is the sort of thing which, I mean, having spent some time working within a foreign ministry, this is exactly the kind of thing that professional diplomats regard with horror. But it works. Now, again, he can do that for two reasons. One is obviously because of Ukraine's current status as the sort of the front line, really, of this sort of wider conflict. But also because he's very good at doing what he does. I mean, actually, it's clear that all those hardliners who were extraordinarily critical of Zelensky before the war, I mean, the number of Ukrainians I'd spoken to who said, oh, he's got no backbone, he can't deal with the crisis, they've been proven wrong. But nonetheless, I think what it does show is that actually leaders and countries can, not by being necessarily a problem, we're going back to that earlier discussion about, should Kosovo be more of a problem? I'm not saying that, but nonetheless, there may be scope for a country such as Kosovo to perhaps break some of the boundaries of the usual diplomatic niceties.
Talking about diplomatic etiquette, what could Kosovo do? Can we tease the imagination to think what can Kosovo do to be recognized by Ukraine?
I get the sense, and look, I've only spoken to a few people who are involved in this aspect of Ukrainian diplomacy. To be honest, I get the sense that, again, this is actually something which is on the move. There is an awareness. Again, I think, in the past, from Ukraine's point of view, it just looked at the fact that Kosovo was part of a country which had then sort of become an independent state and thought, ouch, that doesn't look like a good precedent for the parts of our country which have been sort of ripped away. And to be honest, no one really, other than Kosovo itself, was particularly interested in trying to educate them about the fact that, no, it's not just that this is a different case, it's actually that it's quite the opposite. In many ways, Kosovo and Ukraine are in a strikingly similar position. That is, I think, changing, and I'm certainly hearing that there are other European countries which are also prevailing upon the Ukrainians to this degree. So, I mean, I think that will happen. It's just, again, that they have one or two other things that are higher priority.
But describe the elements of that similar position that you see, because people may see a problem, but why do you think Kosovo and Ukraine are in similar position?
I think if one looks at the situation now, you have a country in form of Ukraine, which used to be part of a wider political unit, which would then sort of fell apart, and it has a much bigger neighbour whose leader essentially feels that it isn't a real country. I mean, it is clear that although many Russians have a different opinion, Putin himself, as we've seen from these very lengthy and rambling and frankly deeply historically problematic essays of his, he does not really think that Ukraine is a country. And this is why he thought he could invade it so easily, because he thought that basically the whole thing would fall apart at the first push. And as a result, he regards its role, its destiny, to be frankly part of Russia's sphere of influence. Well, that is strikingly similar to Vucic's perspective on Kosovo. This notion that it's not actually a legitimate country, that it's only an accident of history, that it is currently sort of presenting itself as being independent, but that its destiny is to be brought back into the control of the metropolis. And in the process, the whole notion of its statehood needs to be devalued and debased. So I think these are the parallels. And as I said, I think there are more and more people in Kyiv who are getting that.
And you also spoke about the fact these are the similarities, but that it's not enough, you said in the end of your talk today, that it's not enough for yourself to want to be a country, declare a country, and decide that if your neighbor, you're going to be forever next to a neighbor who does not accept you, and you should wait. You should look for an opportunity to engage and explain and argument and bring on the neighbors. So I want to talk to you a little bit now about the post-Putin era and how you today suggested that Ukraine should move forward with a post-Putin Russia, and what lessons can there be for Kosovo?
Yes, I mean, look, this is one of the things that really, frankly, concerns me about current policy. And I say this as someone who, although as of June I have been banned from Russia because of my Russophobic views, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry, I regard myself as a friend of Russia and the Russians. It's a country that I have been travelling to for more years than I'd care to remember. I have friends there and so forth. The point is that there is Russia and there is the Putin regime. And although we have absolutely to do everything we can to defeat the invasion of Ukraine, and quite frankly, I think we're moving to a stage where we have to start thinking seriously about whether or not we actually would want to encourage and do everything we can to bring down the Putin regime. But that's a whole other debate.
Do you think we should or not?
I'm beginning to come closer to the sense. I mean, historically, the West has been much better at bringing down regimes than managing what happens afterwards. I think we'd have to think very carefully about it, but I think that is a debate that is worth having.
Not only that, in your podcast, you actually argue there are worse options in Russia than Putin. There are more nationalistic options that we should worry about. Is that what you still worry about?
It is. I think that, again, I mean, if we were clumsy, we could make things worse. But I think, look, the natural order in Russia is, look, Putin, he's just had his 70th birthday. I mean, I don't think he's going to sort of die imminently, but nonetheless, he and his cohort of friends and allies, they are all very much on their way out. And if I look at the younger generation of political leaders who are waiting in the wings, the 50-something and the early 60-year-olds, these are not nice people on the whole. These are pragmatic, ruthless kleptocrats. But the point is the West knows how to deal with pragmatic, ruthless kleptocrats. We do it all the time. And I think that these are the people who, once they're in power, will want to reach a deal with the West simply because they like the good old days when they could steal at home, bank and spend abroad. What's the point in being rich if you can't moor your yacht off Italy, buy yourself a nice penthouse in London, send your kid to a university in America, whatever? But the point is, at the same time, we have to worry about ordinary Russians, who at the moment, unfortunately, are being, on the one hand, told by Putin's propaganda machine that the problem is that the West hates Russians, all Russians. And on the other hand, with some quite clumsy sanctions, the West seems to be almost encouraging that perspective. So I think we need to find ways of reaching out to ordinary Russians, even as we tighten the vice on Putin himself. And so, sorry,
yes.
Again, as you can tell,
Yes.
it's one of these sort of subjects I feel very passionate about. And as regards Ukraine, I mean, this is the interesting thing. Zelensky, I mean, he speaks Russian. He comes from, a Russian-speaking community. He, time and time again, speaks to ordinary Russians in his addresses. And although, obviously, the Russian propaganda state tries to block him out, the message still gets through. Now, whether he's telling ordinary Russians, look, surrender. When you're in battle, surrender and we'll look after you and take care of you. Or whether he's talking to Russians back home and saying, this is Putin's war and you shouldn't let him drag you in. Zelensky understands that. And I think that's an encouraging sign, because otherwise, sure, the Russians may well and probably will suffer a military defeat in Ukraine in due course. It may take some time, it'll probably be very bloody, but that's the trajectory.
And there's very likely that Ukraine is going to reconquer separatist areas there. What is your suggestion how to integrate those separatist areas from before?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a real challenge. And again, it's one I'm hoping the Ukrainians are thinking about, but I'm not quite sure if they are. I think, again, it's going to have to be this very, very careful balance. On the one hand, look, clearly, those people who are involved in atrocities, those people who are involved in the governance structures, they have to face a proper trial for what they did. But on the other hand, there's going to be a lot of people who, frankly, they worked for the government, they were minor civil servants or whatever, because they needed to eat.
They worked for the Russian government, let's be clear.
Well, yeah, but again, I mean, I think one has to be honest that people do things when they are effectively under occupation, which they might not have wanted to do, but they have little option. And again, I think what the Ukrainians will have to be is very, very generous in how they try and reintegrate these people, while at the same time focusing their efforts on almost, shall I say, a lustration process. So that those people who clearly believed in and actively wanted to support the occupation regimes can be sort of weeded out and dealt with. But again, dealt with within the terms of law.
Is there enough, you think, tolerance as things are going ahead in Ukraine to be able to take in these areas without retaliation?
That's going to be so hard. I honestly don't know. I mean, if you look at the devastation of cities like Mariupol, if you look at the atrocities that were carried out in places such as Bucha, I mean, there is a huge charge of anger. And it's going to be very, very hard to deal with that. But in some ways, I mean, we have seen it can work. If one looks at what happened in West Germany after World War II, again, on the one hand, there was huge sort of anger because of this, what had been revealed about the death camps and such like. But ultimately, what was done was actually a very, very deliberate attempt by the West to make West Germany a friend. And I think, okay,
but also, let me also stress there was a genuine dealing with a past process within Germany to accept the crimes that took place. And I want to make that parallel as a historian that you are. Can you imagine 20 years after the Second World War would finish, that the Allies, French, British, would sit down with Goebbels, the Minister of Information of former Germany, like Kosovo sits with former Minister of Information of Milosevic, and say, oh, let's try and make a peace deal. Can you imagine the Allies allowing a Germany that did not deal with its own past? That is what it feels like to be in the Balkans today. Why couldn't we have had a process like the post-Second World War dealing with its own crimes, like Germany did?
Well, I mean, look, you're absolutely right, of course. I mean, again, it's part of Europe's failure to properly address the Western Balkans, a failure to take it seriously. Frankly, it's Western Europe's failure to treat the Western Balkans as part of Europe. But that's, I mean, without in any way trying to defend it, which I'm not, I mean, that is also now past history. We have to deal with the situation we are in now. But again, what that does speak to is exactly that, we're talking about things that are generational, that are cultural, that are about exactly facing up to past crimes. It's going to be incredibly hard for the Ukrainians to not feel, just angry and want to just take that all out. And it's also going to be hard for the people of these occupied regions, particularly ones, Donbass and Lugansk, which have been occupied for 8 years now, to also come to terms with what has been done by them or in their name. Again, there's no easy answers here. Well, likewise, yeah, it's not at all easy. In a way, it's going to be very hard for Kosovo to deal with Serbia. Now, of course, it may well be easier as and when there's a post-Vucic Serbia, but God only knows when that would be.
In the end of our interview, I want to talk a little bit about Weaponisation of Everything, book that you published in 2022. What do you mean by Weaponization of Everything?
It's quite interesting that I wrote this book and it came out just after the invasion of Ukraine, because the main point I was making is, although conventional war as we understand it, shooting wars, are not completely a thing of the past, they are increasingly less useful in the modern world. And what we're actually seeing is increasingly countries turning to other non-military means of contesting with each other. So, sometimes this is very sort of obvious, like, computer hacks and disinformation. Sometimes it's more subtle, such as by, strategic investment, so that you end up more or less buying up all their key industries. It can be by corruption. It can also be by the use of foreign aid. It can be by the use of international law. Essentially, this notion that we're moving into an era in which nations will contest through all kinds of ways that are not necessarily declared wars or anything like that, but are just simply ways of essentially doing what wars are all about, which is to get another country to do something you want it to do. But they've worked out that shooting at them is not necessarily the best way of doing it.
And you described in the introduction of that book an example of what China can do? Is it fictional? Can do to Japan?
It's
Was that fictional?
It's entirely fictional, but it is based on a lot of conversations with people who are professionals in this realm, including some people at GCHQ, which is the British Electronic
Can you
Intelligence
describe that
Agency.
simulation?
What it is essentially is that just one day the power goes out in Japan. And that's not easy because actually Japan has two separate, entirely separate power grids, one for the West and one for the East. And it transpires that over a long period, an exceedingly sophisticated series of malware, sort of computer weapons, have been implanted in the control system. So the power plants are still producing energy, but it's just not being transmitted. Now, a few people die. There's going to be people who are caught in car accidents because there's no traffic lights working or whatever. But essentially, it's more than the country grinds to a halt. Its military can't carry out military exercises it was going to do with the Americans because it's busy distributing aid and diesel generators to hospitals. And just generally, this is crisis. And at the same time, it turns out that a memo is leaked, which was distributed within the government, that said that, in fact, the distribution network was getting a little bit antiquated and really needed to be upgraded. And at this point, in come the Chinese and say, well, look, you've got a big problem. We can address this. We can very, very quickly give you a brand new, shiny, modern power distribution grid. They'd offered this in the past, but each time Japan had said no for security reasons. But now it's desperate. The government is in crisis. People are actually focusing. There's a sort of sudden upsurge in embarrassing stories being leaked about the government. No one's quite sure where they come from. No one's quite sure who's amplifying them. But nonetheless, at the moment, the government is in crisis. A key politician who has always stood out against this dies in what looks like it's just a mugging that went wrong. But nonetheless, without his voice, the government is basically sort of teetering. And then the Chinese deploy their secret weapon, a panda. The Japanese have for a long time not had a panda in one of their zoos, and the Chinese offer a panda. And that's just enough to sort of tip things over. And the clear sort of notion is that basically the Chinese had set out, both for the financial reasons, but also in order to basically acquire control over Japan's power supply, a long-term campaign of firstly building up the situation so they had the cyber capability in order to crash Japan's power distribution grid. They used disinformation, they used sort of suborned elements of the media and the political environment to stir up a crisis for the government. They may well have killed that individual and made it look like it was just a sort of a crime, a random street crime, precisely to actually make sure that he wasn't influencing the debate. And then, obviously, they weaponize their own panda. The point is, each of these elements, well, with the exception of the panda, has been used in the past in different ways. What I did was just create a scenario that brought them together just to illustrate what actually an undeclared 21st century war could look like.
And in the you came out with a book before. In this region, we actually experienced the hacking that Iran did of e-governance and e-processes of Albania. So this audience has seen that happen. In the end, you argue that rather than complain about the hybrid warfare and how everything is getting weaponized and we're not prepared for it, you ask for us to prepare for it, to use our intellect. Mm-hmm. How do you use just intellect to protect yourself from this?
Intellect alone, it needs resources and political will. No, but the point is precisely, a lot of people complain about this and say it's not fair and, we need a treaty to stop cyber attacks or whatever. You can have the best diplomats and the best legal drafters, and you will not create a treaty that has any meaning, not least because it's often very difficult to prove where a cyber attack comes from. So I think rather than just simply complaining, we should just accept this is the nature of the modern world, like it or not, and do several things. One is build in resilience at all time. Expect to be attacked. It's sad to have to be paranoid, but nonetheless, that is the nature of the modern world. So make sure that whenever you create, and e-governance is great, e-commerce is great, we all like to be able to do things seamlessly and buy things online quickly, but security has to be built into all of these processes. That's the first thing. Secondly, we need to have to accept that bad things are still going to happen. We can't deal with everything. It's a little bit like, look, countries that had a serious terrorism problem. After a certain point, you adapt to that, and you realise that, yeah, sometimes terrible things will happen, but you still have to go on with your life. We've become a little bit, well, certainly in the West, we've become a little bit too brittle, a little bit too shocked by when anything goes wrong that we tend to overreact. We need to be sort of balanced about it. And the third and final element is we can use these instruments too. Rather than just simply thinking that's something that these bad guys can do to us and we're stuck with it. No, I mean, we need to acknowledge that actually we need to be in a position to deter and to retaliate when the circumstances arise. And we need to do that really carefully. But on the other hand, I mean, to be honest, if there was, for example, a major, I mean, I'm speaking as a British citizen now, a major attack, let's say, on the systems that keep the National Health Service operating smoothly, that we had a pretty good sense came from Russia. Well, I'm not saying that we should be attacking the Russian health system, because we shouldn't be killing people. But on the other hand, if we could crash all the communications of the Kremlin, just to make a point, we know you did it, and we can hit you back too, then that would absolutely get my vote. So I think it's all about adapting to the new way of war rather than just complaining about it.
Galeotti, thank you for talking to me.
It's a pleasure.